second day, which is a continuation of our training from yesterday on the surface water treatment rule requirements for the revised total coliform rule. So today we're just going to continue where we picked up. However, I wanted to clarify some things based on some questions that came in yesterday. So if you all give me just a few minutes, I'm going to switch between presentations to bring those clarifying issues up. And just as a reminder, your presenters are myself, Cindy Mack, Nancy Ho, and Rudd Coffey. The very first issue I'd like to clarify, apparently there was the slide that was presented having to do with the RTCR timeline specific to Sidwith Prime. The arrow was a bit off. My wording was correct in terms of when we feel the Sidwith Prime components for the RTCR would be available. That is September 2014, but we adjusted it so that it is clear not only in the wording but in the arrows reflecting in the time frame scale that it is 2014. So that is when we feel, or we've been told, that the RTCR compliance determination functions would be available. It would be available for September 2014. Now, in terms of the questions, frequently asked questions, this one came up, and we wanted to try and provide more of a clarification on it. If we still have questions on it, of course, we have SRMD in the room with us. That's Tom and Julie and Sean to answer and to help clarify. But the situation is, what if a system conducts an assessment, sets a timeline for corrective action years into the future, which the primacy agency accepts, but has triggered more assessments before the corrective action can be completed? The system, in terms of the answer, the system would incur a level 1 or a level 2 assessment for each triggered event. The contamination may be caused by a different type of reason. So if the system finds another sanitary defect, the system must correct it. If the contamination continues to be caused by the same reason, the system can perform interim measures that ensures the delivery of the safe water. So basically the lesson here is, although the corrective action has not been completed for that first triggered assessment, if additional triggers for level assessment 1 or level assessment 2 occurs during that period of time, they still must follow through. The system must still follow through on completing those.
And the reason for that, Cindy, is because there might be additional sanitary defects that may not have originally been addressed or identified.
Thank you, Nancy. And so then the next question, and this one keeps coming up, and I think this is, of course, as I stated when I was presenting this information, it's a little tricky and it could be interpreted in several different ways when you read the actual language, but this is the intent of the language. Does each TC positive routine sample need 3 repeat samples? The answer is yes. Each TC positive routine sample needs 3 repeat samples regardless of whether an assessment has been triggered. And it's site specific. So for each site, if you have a TC positive routine, you have to have a set of repeats to follow that. And this is a different type of graphic to help explain that situation a little better. In this situation, we're looking at site A. A routine sample was taken at site A and it was TC positive. That means within 24 hours, the public water system should take a set of repeat samples. So that's round 1 repeat set. In this case, the round 1 repeat set was total coliform positive at 2 of the sites. So the original site tested positive again, and then one of the other sites, whether it's the one 5 connections up or down, downstream or whether it's an alternative site that was approved by the state through the siting plans, it also tested positive. That means that at this point, when these results come back, the system must then do another set, or round 2. So they're only doing 3 more, although 2 of the sites tested positive. You're only doing a set. So the next set, it came back positive for 2 for Site B and Site C. So they now have to do an additional set, round 3. And at this point, it was negative. Now, if this was a small system serving less than, collecting less than 40 samples, their trigger for level 1 assessment would have occurred at this round 1. So then they wouldn't have a need to do round 2 and round 3. However, if it is a system collecting more than 40 samples, then it's the 5% trigger, or, I just lost my thought. The E. coli MCL. Thank you, Nancy. So I know that some states have a stricter way of managing this under the TCR. For example, they would do for the B site that received a total coliform positive, they would require a repeat set for that one and then a different repeat set for the site A. That's not how it is intended under the RTCR. We plan on putting out a fact sheet with better visuals. This is just a visual we threw together this morning that'll really help to try and explain the intent under the RTCR, and hopefully that will help to clarify the confusion in terms of the language and in terms of what is probably going on in many of the states under the TCR. We also, in this particular slide, corrected that one minimum number of samples. It was an incorrect number in the original size set, and we will correct it, but we just wanted you all to see that it's 70 if you're within this population served for that type of public water system.
And to also clarify that, once again, all surface water, groundwater, and direct influence or surface water Goody blended sources, once again, the monitoring frequency is monthly, and there is no reduced monitoring for surface water systems.
So with that, I am going to now go back to where we left off in Rudd's presentation on the training modules, and I believe we left off at corrective actions associated with the level 1 and level 2, so we will begin here.
Good morning, good afternoon. Just to catch everyone up, we had ended yesterday talking about level 1 and level 2 assessments. So remember, this is the treatment technique section of the RTCR. So systems, for a variety of reasons, can be triggered into conducting an assessment. And those assessments differ in terms of their intensity associated with EPA's expectation of what the risk levels are with the different triggers that the system incurred. A reminder that the treatment technique requirements are to conduct the assessment, fill out the assessment forms, submit it to the state on time. Every single significant defect has at least one or more associated corrective actions. Those corrective actions in the form are either marked and shown to be complete, or there's a timetable with a proposed completion date. And so the system is not just on the hook for completing the assessments, but for completing the assessment, submitting the form, and completing the follow-up corrective action. And so now we're to the corrective action portion of this. We're not going to spend tons of time getting into the detail here of the corrective actions. Again, there's going to be a guidance. There's already a draft of it on the EPA's website. And so there's good amounts of additional detail there. And there will be follow-up training on the corrective action. And I think EPA is expecting that corrective actions aren't some, it's not rocket science. It's not, breaking new ground and considering all kinds of way outside the box solutions. As you'll see in the coming slides, most of these are solutions that are fairly standard. They're probably the kinds of things the states and the systems are working on, and even under the TCR, if there was a problem with contamination, that the systems, just out of good practice, would be following up on and implementing. This just formalizes that procedure for the systems to self-diagnose or to work with the state to get diagnosed what their problems are, and then what the response to those problems will be. So first, the timing of the corrective actions. And so we touched on this a little bit yesterday, but we'll go over it again. The system, to satisfy the treatment technique requirements, must complete the corrective actions either within 30 days of the original trigger event, and therefore it's recorded in the form that's submitted, or it has to complete the actions within a state-approved time frame. And that state-approved time frame might be an additional 2 weeks, it might be an additional 2 years, and there might be multiple corrective actions, interim corrective actions, and that you heard Nancy mention that. There's things that the state, the system can do in the meantime and to respond until the ultimate solution is implemented. So that's the time frame, and it's up to the state to review the form that's submitted, the proposed time frame, decide if the proposed time frame is adequate and appropriate, and to either accept that or to push back and have the system come up with a date that's more acceptable. The system is required to notify the state when the scheduled corrective action is complete. Again, we've seen throughout this where there's a lot of dialogue, a lot of conversation that's both encouraged and required back and forth between the system and the state. If a system is not notifying the state of these different milestones in the assessment and corrective action process, that can be considered a reporting violation. And then we'll move into that later. And then finally, either the system or the state at any time can request a consultation with the other party to discuss the corrective action. So just keeping that information wide open. And an important thing to point out here, and that's something that EPA is not pushing, but yesterday there was a discussion of if you had multiple level 1 assessments, that would actually trigger a level 2 assessment unless the initial level 1 assessment, the state had decided the corrective actions had been complete and it solved the issue that initiated the first level 1 assessment. This in here might be where states want to think about when the system notifies the state the corrective action is complete. Is the state going to make a decision or somehow document that the corrective action is complete and that satisfies or fixes the problem that caused the initial level 1 assessment? So you know, there is a process in there that states will need to think through. Common corrective actions, and we're going to show kind of how these apply to some of the common significant defects in just a sec. Disinfection, flushing of the distribution system, flushing of storage, replacement repair of either a failing part of the distribution system or a part of the distribution system where there's suspected biofilm. It could be replacement or repair or cleaning of storage components. So storage is often at fault or suspected to be at fault, so storage maintenance is also important. It might be a one-time storage maintenance corrective action, or it might be an ongoing storage maintenance corrective action that's needed. So the next bullet there, operations plan. So the system might need to develop and implement an operations plan. And again, that's not necessarily a one-time fix. That could be an ongoing fix that is some kind of best practice that the system's going to implement to ensure that the contamination does not happen again. Maintenance of adequate pressure throughout the distribution system, or training on improving sampling techniques. So these are some of the common corrective actions the EPA would expect to see. Again, nothing in here that is real earth-shattering. All right, so then we're not going to dive into these in great detail because it's going to be so much based on case by case, and this will be covered in additional trainings. But you know, a common cause might be failure to disinfect after doing some work on the system, and so maybe the distribution system just needs a little shock and to take care of any kind of lingering contamination introduced during the maintenance. Or there was a main break and that needs disinfection or some additional repair or replacement. There could be holes or other points of entry. The distribution system could be losing pressure, which would allow for inflow and contaminant entry. There could be biofilm accumulation in the distribution system. There could be cross connections, and those are often kind of hidden dangers that only become a problem once contamination is introduced, and that's when systems become aware of it. So these are all kind of some of the common causes that EPA and states have seen in the past and might see again. So inadequate disinfectant residual, this might be where they need to either do a one-time kind of flushing or disinfection event, or make it part of their ongoing operations and maintenance practices. Contaminated sampling taps, this could be additional training of the folks sampling. This could be repair, replacement of distribution system, or even of the taps or the local plumbing itself to get something that's safe. Installing a sampling tap, for instance. And finally, problems with protocol, problems with procedure, and those are more kind of human-based training and operations and development improvements. And so then we come to kind of a summary slide, and I want to spend a little time on this because we spent a good amount of time on this. It's fairly dense, but the good news is I think this is the one slide that really does the best job of assimilating all that we've thrown at you so far into one place where if you needed a quick pocket guide of, okay, which one triggers an MCL violation and which one triggers an assessment, this is the best that we could of pulling all that together in one place. So these top 4 rows here, 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the rows that lead to an E. coli MCL violation. We went over those yesterday. So there's a routine E. coli result and a total coliform positive result in the repeat samples. Or the reverse, there's a total coliform positive found during routine monitoring and an E. coli found in the repeat samples. Or there's an E. coli during the routine and they missed any one of the repeat samples required. Or there was a total coliform positive in the routine, and there was a total coliform positive in the repeat, and the E. coli was missed during the repeat. So these are all examples of combination of factors that, A, trigger an E. coli MCL violation, which we'll talk about later, has the acute public notification response, but B, it also triggers the level 2 assessment. And then the 5th row here summarizes that if you have a total coliform positive, total coliform positive in your routine and you miss any one of your repeat samples, it's not a violation. There's no MCL violation. There would be a monitoring violation, but there's no more significant violation. But it does trigger a level 1 assessment. And then these next 2 rows identify the other ways that you trigger a level 1 assessment. So that's just having some combination of total coliform positive results during routine and repeat monitoring, pooling all those together. A level 1 assessment is required either if you exceed 5%, if you take at least 40 samples a month, or if you exceed 2 positive total coliform samples if you take less than 40 samples a month. That triggers a level 1, and then this last note reminds us that you have to conduct a level 2 if one level 1 assessment's already been triggered in the last 12 months. And as a reminder, with the exception of if the state has deemed the initial level 1 assessment, if that contamination has been corrected by the corrective action. All right, so the last thing I want to point out here, and this is where we're going to tweak the slide for the future, is that under the monitoring, it's really important, this is a change under RTCR, and we want to be really clear about it, is that once one of these thresholds have been passed, so that you have an E. coli violation, or you're triggering a level 1 assessment or a level 2 assessment, that doesn't mean you get to stop doing your monitoring that's required with the RTCR, your monthly routine samples. You still have to take the monthly routine samples, and in fact, you still have to take the repeat samples that would be required if any of these routine samples have a total coliform positive. The exception on the repeat samples is that at some point after the first set of repeat samples, if you've already triggered your assessment, or if you're already, then you don't have to keep doing additional repeat sets. but you still have to do your routine samples and at least one round of repeat samples, even if you've already triggered your assessment. I want to make sure with our SRMD folks that we got that A-OK. If we need to revisit, we can take it up at one of the Q&As if you guys want to.
Well, just one thing, if I remember correctly, the requirement to continue and take all of your routine samples is also in the existing total coliform rule. That is not a new requirement. That is a continuation of an existing requirement.
Yeah, I guess what's new is that in this case, that even if a treatment technique exceeding for equal MCL violation occurs, that's the new aspect, right? That you might have a treatment technique exceedance and have to do an assessment,
right,
whereas in the current GCR you didn't have to do that.
Right. That's the difference. It's the assessment rather than the MCL. But under both rules, whenever something is triggered, you're still required to continue until you have taken all of your required routine samples, and you are still required to take at least one round of repeat samples for any total coliform positive routine sample under any circumstances.
Thank you, Tom.
So now we've blown through our summary of the corrective action portion of the slide and turn it over to Nancy to present to us a polling question.
Brett, if you could advance the slide for me.
Sure.
So for our next polling question, we just want to hammer home certain concepts. So we want to make sure that you guys, take a look at slide 119 as your guide there. And
sorry.
So for this example, we have a water system that has taken routine samples, and the routine sample is total coliform positive but E. coli negative. And this water system did not follow up with doing any of the repeat samples. So what type of violation or what occurs in this situation? So I'm going to launch the poll so that you guys can weigh in on that. So we have currently about 50% of the folks voting. I'm just going to wait a little bit longer before I close the poll. Okay, we have about 80% of the attendees who have voted. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So many of you guys have said that this is quite interesting. Either a monitoring violation, about 65% of attendees voted for that. Others said a level 1 assessment trigger, and then a few others said a level 2 assessment trigger. So the actual answer is, let me actually close this poll and hide it, it's a level 1 assessment is triggered if there has not been a second level 1 trigger in the previous 12 rolling months. So you always need to check for that. A level 2 assessment is triggered if this is the second level 1 that has occurred within the previous 12 rolling months. With the caveat that unless the state has determined that the reason for the first level 1 and that the system has corrected the sanitary defects.
Okay. So now, thank you, Nancy. We're going to dive right into the reporting and record-keeping requirements. So we should be on slide 124. Okay. So this slide shows what the systems must report to the state. And I don't believe, other than the new features having to do with assessments, the remaining information should be the same as it was under the TCR. So in addition to the pertinent requirements of 40 CFR 141.31, which requires public water systems to report to the state, such as within 10 days of completing any public notification, the system must report that to the state. Anything having to do with their analytical or test measure results, so on and so forth. The public water systems must also provide the following information to the state under the RTCR. The E. coli MCL violations and the E. coli positive routine sample results by the end of the day when the system is notified of the test results, unless the system learns of a violation after the state office is closed and the state does not have either an after-hours phone line or an alternative notification procedure. In this case, the system must notify the state before the end of the next business day. Anything having to do with treatment technique violations for coliform must be reported by the end of the following business day. And level 1 or level 2 assessment reports within 30 days of exceeding the treatment technique trigger. When it comes to the coliform monitoring violations, it must be reported within 10 days of learning of the violation. Notification of completion of corrective action is completed after the submittal of the assessment report, 30 days from exceeding the trigger, and according to the state-approved schedule. Certification by seasonal systems that they have complied with the state-approved startup procedures is prior to serving water to the public. Reporting violations. Under the RTCR, a public water system would receive a reporting violation if they complete their monitoring or assessment as required, but failed to submit the results or assessment form to the state within the required time frame. They would get a reporting violation. If they fail to notify the state within a timely manner of a routine or a repeat E. coli positive result, that would be a reporting violation. If they fail to submit to the state certification of completion of the state-approved startup procedures, that would be a reporting violation. Public water systems that fail to take all the required repeat samples or all the routine samples that are total coliform positive would not receive a monitoring violation, but it is required to conduct a level 1 assessment. Failure to conduct that level 1 assessment would then lead to a treatment technique violation. When it comes to the record keeping, what the public water systems must maintain, any records of action taken by the system to correct their violations must be kept for 3 years. Public notices that are issued and certifications made, 3 years. Records of microbiological analysis, 5 years. Copies of monitoring plans as long as analyses are required. Level 1 and Level 2 assessment forms, the system must keep that for 5 years. Documentation of corrective actions, 5 years. Other available summary documentation of the sanitary defects and the corrective actions, 5 years. Records of any repeat samples taken that meet the state's criteria for an extension of the 24-hour period for collecting the repeat samples, 5 years. In terms of the state, what the state needs to keep in terms of records, when it comes to the microbiological analyses, 1 year. Everything else, 5 years. So decisions to waive the 24-hour time limit in collecting those repeat samples, decisions for unfiltered surface water systems to collect TC sample following a turbidity measurement, decisions to waive the requirement for 3 routine samples the month following a TC positive, decisions to invalidate a TC positive sample, and completing and approving the level 1 and level 2 assessments, 5 years. State has discretion here, so decisions to allow a system to forego an E. coli testing of a TC positive sample if that system assumes that the sample is EC positive in such a manner that each system's current status may be determined. And that takes us to our polling question, and while I turn this over to Nancy, we're also working on some of the questions that have come in and may answer that immediately following the polling question.
I'm going to launch our poll here. We were curious from the state whether you guys have an after-hours phone or alternative procedure for water systems when there is an E. coli MCL violation, or they find that they have an E. coli positive result after normal business hours. So we kind of wanted to see what that was for your state. Okay, we have about 75% of the attendees who have voted. I am going to go ahead and wait a little bit longer. For regions who do direct implementation, this would be an applicable question for you too, for EPA regions. So feel free to vote. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. We have about 76% of the people who have voted. I'm going to share the results. And as you guys can see here, the majority of states and regions do have an after-hours emergency number or contact information for when there's an E. coli positive result. So that's a good thing. That's especially important now that under the revised total coliform rule, an E. coli positive result could trigger a level 2 assessment, and there's that 30-day window to conduct that assessment.
Okay, let me just see if we are ready to answer any of the questions that have come our way. No, we're still working on them. So I'll go right into categories of the RTCR violations. All of what you're going to see in the next few slides, you've already heard in the context of different portions of the presentation that we've provided. But this is in the context just specific to how the violation categories pan out. So under the RTCR, there are basically 4 categories of violations. You can either, the public water system can either get an E. coli MCL violation, a treatment technique violation, a monitoring violation, and a reporting violation. Now, it's important to note if it wasn't mentioned or if none of the participants recognize this, but under the RTCR, the monitoring and the reporting violations are now separated. Under the TCR, it was one type of violation. It is now 2 separate violations. So a public water system incurs an E. coli MCL violation when the following occurs. And you've seen this in several different visuals and formats. The first one is if a routine sample is E. coli positive and the repeat sample is total coliform positive. The next is if the public water system fails to take all the required repeat samples at an E. coli positive routine sample. The next one is a routine sample is total coliform positive and the repeat sample is E. coli positive. And the last one is a repeat sample is total coliform positive and the sample is not tested for E. coli. Now remember, if a system incurs an E. coli MCL violation, it must issue a Tier 1 PN, and we're going to talk more about that in a few. The treatment technique violation, what triggers a treatment technique violation? It's any of the following three triggers. Failure to conduct a Level 1 or a Level 2 assessment within 30 days of the trigger. Failure to correct all sanitary defects from a Level 1 or Level 2 assessment within 30 days of trigger or in accordance with a schedule acceptable by the state. Failure for a seasonal system to complete state-approved startup procedures prior to serving water to the public. For any of these events, the system would receive a treatment technique violation. For monitoring violations, the system would receive this violation for failing to take the routine total coliform sample. They would also receive, if a monitoring violation, if the public water system fails to analyze for E. coli following a total coliform positive routine sample. The public water system has incurred a monitoring violation that requires a Tier 3 public notification. But remember from the previous slide, if, however, a public water system fails to analyze for E. coli following a total coliform positive repeat sample, the public water system has incurred an E. coli MCL violation that requires a Tier 1 public notice. And we're going to talk about this more, but we just wanted to sort of highlight it as I'm presenting these couple of slides. So this tries to be the catch-all on the way the violations and the triggers, but you've seen a different version of this when Rudd presented his. But basically, your monitoring failures would be the first two, and you would get a monitoring violation. Then your E. coli MCL violations would be the last two. But failure to take a repeat sample following a TC positive routine sample is not a violation. It triggers a Level 1 assessment. Then non-performance of that Level 1 assessment can then trigger a treatment technique violation. So you'll see more about this in a bit. Now, back to a polling question. You ready for the polling question, Nancy?
Yes. So let me go ahead and launch the poll here. Having a little bit of technical difficulty with
we could just read it.
my polls. So I'm not going to launch a poll, but I'm just going to go ahead and read the question here. So failure to take a repeat RTCR sample following a routine E. coli positive sample is what type of violation? So I'm going to give you guys some time to think about that. And then go ahead and show the answer. So just wanted to remind everyone that a routine E. coli positive sample without any following repeat samples is an E. coli MCL violation.
See? So now we have a bit of a pop quiz.
Okay, so hopefully you guys are still with us. Just to hammer home the types of different violations, so just go ahead and review your notes if needed. If a public water system fails to analyze for E. coli following a total coliform positive routine sample, the public water system has incurred what type of violation? Okay, thinking about that. Also, if a public water system fails to analyze for E. coli following a total coliform positive repeat sample, then what type of violation has the water system incurred? And the nuance here is looking at the sample result related to a routine sample versus the sample result related to a repeat sample. So going to the answer. So in the first scenario, it is a monitoring violation if there is a routine total coliform positive sample with a failure to analyze for E. coli. Okay, in the second example, if a water system fails to analyze for E. coli following a total coliform positive, and the difference here is the repeat sample, then the water system has incurred an E. coli MCL violation.
Thank you, Nancy. And so to finish up the violation, our last slide is on, our last two slides are on the reporting violation. A public water system is in violation of a reporting requirement when any of the following occurs. Failure to submit their monitoring reports, failure to submit their level 1 or level 2 assessments within 30 days of the trigger, failure to notify the state by the end of the next business day following an E. coli positive sample or E. coli MCL violation, failure for a seasonal system to timely submit certification of completion of their state-approved startup procedures, failure to timely notify state of the failure to correct all sanitary defects found during the level 1 or level 2 assessment, failure to timely notify the state of monitoring violations, and failure to notify the state when each outstanding corrective action is completed for those actions uncompleted by the assessment form submission date. And I do want to take a moment to see if we can answer some of the questions that might have come in. Do we have any questions that we can answer or would like to answer? Okay. We have a few questions that we'd like to answer before we go into the next polling question, and then we'll pick up with the slides having to do with PN and CCR.
Okay, so there are like some questions regarding the number of repeat samples you have to take. As we say, for every routine sample, you have to take 3 repeat samples. And for the additional round, so I'm saying if, for round 2, you have to take an additional set of 3. So it's not for each PC positive repeat. It's another, yeah, so Cindy's showing the graphics on your screen. So, for every routine, there's 3. Then after that, it's 3. So, so it's not, it doesn't cascade. Thank you.
But yeah, just to be clear, so, and the question came in, so if you had 4 routine positives, there was some confusion about how many repeats there would be needed, but if you had 4 routine positives, you need 3 repeats for each of them, so that would be 12 repeats.
Okay. The question, so I'm just going to go down the list here. So there's a question, purchase, I guess this is purchase surface water and purchase groundwater. How are they treated in terms of monitoring? For purchase surface water, it's a monthly monitoring. For purchase groundwater, unless, well, if it's under the direct influence, then it is monthly monitoring.
One other thing, I know, or it's my understanding that in CIDWIS that sometimes the code is based on the largest source. So if you have a groundwater purchase system, but you also have some amount of surface water or groundwater under the direct influence of surface water, basically we operate with a one-drop rule. If you have any surface water, whether it's as a consecutive system or as the source that you operate, you are considered a subpart H system and are required to monitor monthly. There's no provision for any monitoring at a frequency of less than monthly, regardless of how much, even if you get the vast majority of your water from a groundwater source, or whether you're a community or non-community system. All systems that have any surface water at all must monitor surface water systems under this rule.
Okay, so other questions? The clarification about missing the repeats. So missing the repeats is a trigger for a level 1 assessment. It's not defined as a monitoring violation. Missing a routine or additional routine is classified as a monitoring violation. So that's sort of, I think that's sort of different under the TCR. Right here.
There's a question about what is the violation if you fail to do an assessment, and what is the violation if you do an assessment but you don't report it. So if you fail to do an assessment, it's a treatment technique violation. If you do the assessment but you fail to submit the form, that is a reporting violation.
Okay. Here's another question. So system has an EC positive routine sample but does not collect repeat samples. So what type of violation is it? So it's an E. coli MCL violation, but not a monitoring violation because you got an MCL, so that's like more severe than a monitoring violation.
There's still some confusion, or a little bit of confusion, about what samples count towards your monthly total. So routine and repeat samples both count towards the number of samples that you're collecting in a month. If you take 30 routines and then you trigger repeats and say you have to take 10 more samples because you have the repeats to take, your total for the month is 40, and that's where you base your compliance and your trigger determinations on.
So if you, just to add on to that, so if you take 30 and then let's say you take 6 more repeats, so your total is now 36. So now you base your compliance on 36, not 40.
There's a question about shouldn't a system need to take samples after an assessment to make sure that they are not continuing to have problems. And it's not required by the rule, but it might be a good action in some cases. And the states can always require a system to take additional actions. So if they feel that it's appropriate to monitor after a corrective action phase, then that's a judgment call that the state can make.
Okay, there's a question of if you already triggered a level 2 assessment and then they found another problem, would that trigger a separate level 1 or will that also be a level 2? It depends on what triggered your assessment. So it could be another level 1, it could be another level 2. There's one, that's a set correction. Okay.
We're not ready to discuss the technical corrections. We'll do that towards the end of the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, because there's a question here.
Okay, I'm going to hold that towards the end. So are we good?
Yeah, and then there's another question about coding, how you're going to code to show that failure to take a repeat is not a monitoring violation, and that's something that the CIDWIS Prime will handle.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
To revisit just very quickly the assessment issue, if you have, for example, let's say you have a level 2 assessment triggered by an E. coli MCL violation, and then later in the month you have a level 1 assessment triggered by exceeding the number of total coliform positive samples, what may be involved in those two assessments may be very different because you're looking at different things. The E. coli is an acute risk. The other is indicative of a possible breach to the integrity, but not yet with fecal contamination. And it may also be in a different part of the distribution system. So the basic test you look for is how do we protect public health, because this is a public health protection program. And so in determining the scope and the number of extents, that should always be part of the state's consideration in determining how to handle it. It's possible that the state could just expand the scope of the level 2, or if the level 2 had already been completed, require a level 1 that's appropriate to the particular facts for the case.
Thank you, Sean, Julie, and Tom. So now we're going to go back to the presentation, and we'll start off with a polling question. Nancy?
Okay, for our next polling question, I'm going to launch it really quickly so you guys can see it on your screen. So failure for a seasonal water system, and remember seasonal water systems are non-community water systems. So failure for a seasonal non-community water system to complete state-approved startup procedures prior to serving water to the public is what type, is a treatment technique violation. Is this true or false? Okay, we have about 50% of folks voted, so I will wait a little bit longer before I close the poll. Okay, we have about 70% of attendees who have voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. And most of the attendees did get this correct. Failure to complete state-approved startup procedures prior to serving water to the public is a treatment technique violation.
This is Rudd again. We've gone over now the violations that are built into the RTCR, the revised total coliform rules. So now we're going to talk about what you have to do when you have a violation, and there's going to be some caveat to that because when there's a violation, then there's public notification ramifications, and there are things you have to do in your consumer confidence report. There are also cases where you don't have a violation and there's nothing you have to do in your public notification in terms of additional requirements. But we will talk about this. There are some follow-up actions like conducting an assessment, which isn't a violation but does go in your consumer confidence report. So we'll talk about violations and additional requirements and how those impact public notification and the consumer confidence report. Real fast on public notification, as Cindy laid out, there are a couple main groups of violations. So there is the E. coli MCL violation. The PN required for that is going to be Tier 1 public notification. And so here's the Tier 1. Here are the 4 different cases of how you get an E. coli MCL violation that we've gone over. If it's a violation associated with a treatment technique, and that can take one of 2 forms. That can be a treatment technique violation because you failed to do something associated with one of your assessments or corrective actions, or it could be a treatment technique violation because you're a seasonal system that didn't comply with the startup procedures. Those are the 3 treatment technique requirements, or the treatment technique requirements that are embedded in the revised total coliform rule. Those violations are Tier 2, and we'll talk about what that means in terms of public notification. And then for all monitoring violations and reporting violations, those get Tier 3 public notification. So these two tables were just a summary of all the different types of violations that Cindy just ran us through, and this is how they're handled in terms of reporting requirements. So for the Tier 1 public notification requirements, nothing has changed here. It is within 24 hours of knowing of the violation, the system has to issue Tier 1 public notification, and there's new language in terms of health effects language that's available and required under the revised total call form rule. And they also have to inform the primacy agency. And so the repeat notices, in terms of Tier 1 repeat notices, that is also something that hasn't changed in terms of that's required, but that's required per the requirements of the primacy agency. So this is one of those things. We have the state modification icon here is because states vary quite a bit in terms of what kind of repeat notice they require under Tier 1. And then the systems must comply with any additional public notification requirements that the state has. And there are acceptable forms of delivery for public notification. Those have also not changed. Those are the same as under the 1989 TCR, but states are allowed to identify additional delivery vehicles for that public notification. Tier 2 public notification, again, this is required if there's a treatment technique violation. That notification is due within 30 days of learning of the violation. The system must issue the Tier 2 public notification. There is standard health effects language that's available now under RTCR. And then the repeat notification is that every 3 months that that problem persists, the system must continue to conduct that public notification. So just a point of clarification here, under the TCR there was a monthly MCL violation, and there was associated public notification and health effects language. Because we have eliminated, or EPA has eliminated that MCL, that monthly MCL violation, that notification is no longer applicable, and that public health effect language is no longer applicable. Then finally, Tier 3 public notification. This is required for monitoring violations and reporting violations that trigger Tier 3 public notification. And so, and I'm going to talk about that because there's a little wrinkle in there, and it's not really spelled out in the slide. But within 1 year of the violation, the system has to issue Tier 3 public notification. If the timing works out that that can be included in the Consumer Confidence Report, that is adequate to include that public notification in the Consumer Confidence Report. And then every 12 months, if the problem persists, that notification needs to be repeated, and it can be repeated in subsequent Consumer Confidence Reports. So this is where the revised total call form rule differs somewhat, which is the monitoring violations are treated separate from the reporting violations. So if a system has a monitoring violation and a reporting violation, it has two separate violations. The monitoring violations always require Tier 3 public notification. The reporting violations, Tier 3 is required if it was a monitoring report or an assessment form that failed to get reported. So there are some other reporting violations that aren't actually triggering Tier 3. So the Tier 3 is required for any reporting violation if it's associated with failing to report monitoring results, or if it's failure to submit on time an assessment form. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Nancy now for our next check-in, an interactive exercise.
Great. If you could advance this to the next slide, that would be fantastic. So just wanted to make sure we understood all the public notice requirements. So in this example, if you could review the information and select which one of these, there may be more than one, are a reporting violation. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the poll here. Remember, you can select more than one answer. Okay, we have only about 60% of our attendees who have voted, so I am going to wait a little bit longer. I am going to go ahead and close the poll now, that we have about 70% of folks who have voted, and share the results. So the most popular answer here is failure to submit a monitoring report in a timely manner. And the actual correct answer is all of these examples listed above are reporting violations. So it should be all of them if I can close the poll here and hide it, and so you guys can see the next. There we go. So it is all of these are examples of a reporting violation.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. I think we've reached our 1 hour mark. So what I'd like to do to give the people in the room some time to collect their thoughts on the questions that have come in, and to give you, the participants, some time to remove your eyes from the screen. We're going to take a 15-minute break and return at, what time is it, somebody? It's 1:30. So we'll return at 1:50, and I'll put a break slide up in 2 seconds. But we apparently continue to have the same questions on things we covered earlier in the afternoon. So we thought we would just flash a couple of slides back up, and then we'll move right into the remaining portion of the CCR presentation, the PN and CCR presentation that Rudd was giving. So back to this question again. So the issue continues to be what happens when a system has triggered an assessment, but the corrective action is going to take several years, and during that time frame, the system continues to get other events that trigger more assessments. What occurs? The answer would be the system would incur a level 1 and a level 2 assessment for each triggered event. So if the system, after that first initial triggered event for an assessment, continues to get more events that triggers it per the requirements into a level 1 or a level 2 assessment, they would continue to have to conduct and perform those individual assessments. So I think that helps to cover that, unless Tom wants to add more to that in any way. Okay. So now we're going to move to the other question that keeps coming up, and it's back to this whole situation on when to take a repeat. Per the revised total coliform rule, repeats are required anytime a routine sample is TC positive. If any of those first round of repeats are positive, you then take another set of repeats. A set is always just 3 samples, and the set is initiated off of the same sampling site that tested positive for the routine. So you continue to do that until either you continue to take the repeats, the set of repeats, if your repeats continue to come back positive, until you have results that are negative, or if you are triggered into doing an assessment, at that point the public water system can stop taking the repeats, but they must notify the state of that fact. Does anyone want to add to that to help clarify that anymore? Okay. We're going to, I'm having head shaking no here, so we're going to go right into the presentation.
Okay, so we left off talking about public notification, and now we're going to get into some of the public notification language that is part of the revised total call form rule and what's required in the different scenarios that public notification is required. So the first is for Tier 1 public notification, which is when there is a violation of the E. coli MCL. This is the new language, and so this replaces or is a revision of the language under the total call form rule. A few key changes. Fecal coliforms, the phrase fecal coliforms was dropped out of this language because it is no longer being a part of the standard. And microbes was replaced and with human pathogens. So again, this is being more specific, really drilling into the fact that we're just focusing on E. coli here, not microbes in general. For Tier 2 public notification, and this is just a reminder, Tier 2 public notification is not required when you have to do an assessment. If you have to do an assessment, and if you do everything right with your assessment, there's no public notification required as just further assessment, the assessment and the follow-up action. If, however, you don't follow the treatment technique assessment provisions, so you either fail to conduct an assessment or fail to implement the corrective actions, then you would have a Tier 2 treatment technique violation. This is the required information, the required language that must be included per the revised total call form rule on your Tier 2 public notification. In addition to this paragraph at the top, you would need to include one or both of these statements if they are applicable. So that either that you failed to conduct the required assessment or you failed to correct the sanitary defects that were found. So one or both of those may be required depending on your case, and you'd work that out with the state. In addition, on the Tier 2 treatment technique violation, there's additional language here, and this language is must be included if you fail to conduct an assessment. And again, here's the information at the bottom that you failed to conduct the required assessment. Sorry, let me go back real fast. Let me point out. This slide here that we had just talked about is a treatment technique violation related, a Tier 2 violation where there was presence of E. coli. So the language on this differs. If the assessment is not triggered by the presence of E. coli, but just solely by the presence of total coliform, then you would use the second slide language. And so you'd use that paragraph, and you'd use the applicable sentence here at the bottom. And then if it's a seasonal system that fails to follow the startup procedures, that's also a treatment technique violation, and this is the required language here. This is the required language, and then there might be additional language per the rule here at the bottom. So that's wrapping up the public notification requirements. In addition, there's communication requirements that are part of the Consumer Confidence Report. So this slide summarizes the before and after of what's required in the Consumer Confidence Report per the revised total call form rule. Up until March 31st, 2016, systems will continue to report in their Consumer Confidence Report on the either number, percentage of total call form samples, fecal coliform positives, and E. coli positives. Starting April 1st, 2016, the total coliform and the fecal coliform reporting requirements will be dropped so that the Consumer Confidence Report will only include data on E. coli results. In addition, and we're going to cover this in the coming slides, in addition to reporting on any kind of E. coli presence results, systems are also required to report on Level 1 or Level 2 assessments that were conducted in the year covered by the Consumer Confidence Report. And we've broken this down into 4 cases. And these cases we took all the possible scenarios of how systems and what they would need to include in their Consumer Confidence Report, and we mapped those to 4 different scenarios. So case 1, this system is required to comply with a level 1 or level 2 assessment report. and it's not due to a E. coli MCL violation. Case 2, apologize. Case 2 is a system that's required to comply with a level 2 assessment due to an E. coli MCL violation. Case 3 is for systems that detected E. coli and violated the E. coli MCL. Case 4 are for systems that found E. coli but did not violate the E. coli MCL. Okay, so for case 1, this is where there was a level 1 or a level 2 assessment not due to an E. coli MCL violation. The systems must include the following elements in their CCR, and we'll go over this in greater detail in the coming slides. The definition of that assessment, the health effects language for total call forms, the number of assessments required, the number of assessments completed, the number of corrective actions required, and the number of corrective actions completed. The number of level 2 assessments required, level 2 assessments completed, corrective actions required, and corrective actions completed associated with those level 2 assessments. And then any failures to complete any of those required steps. So this first slide summarizes those definitions. So this is the level 1 assessment definition. And so if a level 1 was conducted during that calendar year that's covered by the Consumer Confidence Report, you would include a level 1 assessment definition. If you had to do a level 2 assessment, then you'd use that definition. So one or both of these definitions could be included in your Consumer Confidence Report. In addition to the definitions, you need to have the required health effects language. Again, this is the health effects language where you conducted an assessment that was not due to an E. coli MCL. You report on the results of those assessments. So how many assessments did you complete? How many were required? How many corrective actions did you have? And how many corrective actions were completed? And again, there's one section for level 1 assessment, so you would summarize all the level 1 assessments into those pieces of data. And there's an additional set of language for level 2 assessments, so you might have to include one or both of these categories. And finally, if you failed to complete all of the assessments or corrective actions that were required, you would need to include one or both of these statements as appropriate. So those are the Consumer Confidence Report requirements for Case 1. For Case 2, where there was a Level 2 assessment report and that Level 2 was required due to an MCL violation, you have to include, this looks similar to what we were looking at, but now we're really focused on a Level 2 assessment. So that definition of a Level 2 assessment, the health effects language for E. coli, which we'll see, the reason for conducting the Level 2 assessment, and if you failed to complete any of those assessment or corrective action steps. So here's the definition of the Level 2 assessment. This language differs from the earlier language because it includes the reason that it's due to an E. coli MCL violation. So systems have to make sure they use the appropriate language. Also, the health effects language shown here in this slide also differ from the previous slide because the focus is on the E. coli and the health risk associated with E. coli. In addition to including those first two elements, they also have to include the reason for conducting the Level 2 assessment, and so the number of corrective actions and how many corrective actions were completed. And then finally, if there was a failure to conduct or complete any of the steps associated with an assessment, that also has to be disclosed in the Consumer Confidence Report. For Case 3, this is a case where there was E. coli found and there was an E. coli violation. So in addition to Case 2, so Case 2 is there's an E. coli violation and there's a Level 2 assessment. So if you do Case 2, you always have to do Case 3 and vice versa. Case 2 and Case 3 go along together. So in this case, in addition to reporting on the Level 2 assessment that had to be done, they have to include language that's required because there was an E. coli MCL violation. So in the table of contaminant results, you have to include the appropriate information for the E. coli MCL, the MCL level, the MCLG, the health effects, etc. Also, the system will need to include which statement here is appropriate for how they violate that E. coli MCL. And again, there are 4 different paths to violation, and so depending on how many different paths took them and how many different E. coli MCL violations they'd have, you would include 1 or more of these 4 bullets. And then finally, in case 4, if there was E. coli detected but no E. coli MCL violation, you would include this information. And the reason this is interesting is because you may have to do nothing else. You could detect E. coli but not have to do any kind of assessment report or assessment follow-up. But you still, because E. coli is considered a contaminant, you need to include those appropriate fields in the contaminant table and include a statement that explains that although the system has detected E. coli, there was no violations of the E. coli MCL. So that's the information that's required as part of the Consumer Confidence Report requirements as part of the revised total call form rule. And I'll turn it over to Nancy to check in how this is sitting.
So we have another poll here. Many of the things that we have heard from some of the EPA regions and from some of the states is that they will be implementing parts of the revised total call form rule earlier than April 1st, 2016. So in that case, we're kind of curious to see if your state does plan on implementing earlier than this date or later than this date. We'd like to get an idea of your implementation effective date. So if you could please go ahead and vote and let us know, that would be helpful. And this is especially useful for us in terms of making sure that we get certain guidance documents out to you in the proper time frame, especially as resources are somewhat limited. It helps us prioritize certain documents. Okay, so we currently have about 46% of our attendees who have voted. And it seems to kind of have stalled out from there, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. Or maybe I should keep that open a little bit longer while you guys are doing internal debates.
And we're not keeping track of who answers what on this.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll at 47% of attendees voting and share the results here. So it seems like the majority of those who have responded that they'll implement the rule between January 1st, 2016 and December 31st, 2016. Thank you guys for voting.
Okay, now we're going to talk about how the revised total call form rule and the new provisions interact with other rules and other aspects of requirements that pertain to public water systems. Please note that we're not there, although there is a lot of interaction with the groundwater rule, we're not covering that today. That will be covered next month at the groundwater training. So there is some interaction with the suite of surface water treatment rules. and in particular with those systems, either surface water or groundwater under direct influence of surface water or purchased surface water that are unfiltered. And they could lose their filtration status based on the monitoring results under the revised total call form rule. So the changes in the revised total call form rule are a change to the criteria. So we've eliminated the total call form positive MCL requirement that was derived from the total call form rule. That's no longer a criteria beginning in April 1st, 2016 for losing filtration status. And what has been inserted is if there is an E. coli positive MCL, that would be a criteria for losing unfiltered eligibility. In addition, we just wanted to remind folks that under the surface water treatment rule, the provision has not changed that anytime you take a total call form sample, a total call form rule sample, and beginning in April 1st, 2016, a revised total call form rule sample, then the system is also required to take a disinfectant residual sample. So systems are still on the hook for taking a sample of residual disinfectant residual at the same time and place as any total call form sample. That applies to both routine and repeat samples. Going back to the unfiltered system status, unfiltered systems must conduct monthly routine revised total call form rule monitoring, and that's required of all subpart H systems anyway. And they must provide filtration if they are not in compliance. And what? Okay, they lose the ability to remain unfiltered if they're not in compliance in at least 11 of, that's a typo, not or, in 11 of the 12 previous months. So that means they need, in 11 of the 12 previous months, they need to be in compliance with the E. coli MCL and with all treatment technique requirements. In addition, these systems must also collect one additional total call form sample near the first service connection on any day that the turbidity exceeds 1 NTU. And so this needs to be collected, this additional total call form sample needs to be collected within 24 hours of the exceedance. And this total call form sample is included in the pool of routine and repeat samples that are used to determine RTCR compliance, that are determined whether you either hit that 5% threshold to trigger level 1 assessment, or if you're sampling less than 40 times a month, the need to have no more than one total call form positive sample or a level 1 assessment is triggered. So that additional sample or samples would be included. On the variance and exemptions front, there is no variance and exemption provisions for the E. coli MCL because of the acute public health concerns associated with the presence of E. coli. In addition, EPA is eliminating the variance provision that allow the system to demonstrate that an MCL of total call form was due to biofilm and not other contamination, because that total call form MCL violation has been removed. And because we now have a series of provisions in the assessments and the associated corrective actions, which would allow systems to demonstrate if there was a biofilm problem and to address that. Consecutive systems. There's nothing specific in the revised total call form rule that's different or unique in terms of how it is applied to consecutive systems. Consecutive systems must monitor for the total call form based on the population served by the consecutive system. And this is something, excuse me, that these consecutive systems should know and have established and worked out with the state by now. In addition, the source type of the wholesale system, so if the wholesale system is a subpart H system, i.e. a surface water system, groundwater in the direct influence of surface water system, or a blended system, that source type would then be what is applicable for all systems that are downstream. Yes, Tom?
The one exception to it being based on the source type of the wholesale system is where the consecutive system has its own source as a subpart H source, and the wholesale system is a groundwater-only system. So in that case, you monitor based on the fact that you have subpart H, even though it's not from the wholesale system, it's from your own source. So if you have either purchased or your own source that's surface water or groundwater under the direct influence of surface water, you monitor as a subpart H system.
Thank you, Tom. And so that completes our discussion of the interaction of the revised total call form rule with other rules. I'm going to turn it over to Nancy for our polling question number 15.
Our next polling question is a true-false question. So true or false, please select the answer. Unfiltered subpart H systems must collect at least one total coliform sample near the first service connection each day turbidity exceeds 5 NTU. Is this true or false? So we currently have about 60% of the attendees who have voted, and it's kind of slowed down from here, and I realize some states may not even have unfiltered surface water systems, and that's quite okay too. Might be considered better by some. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll here and share the results. And the majority of attendees have responded with false. And that is the correct answer because it exceeds 1 NTU. So each time the subpart H system exceeds 1 NTU, they must collect at least one total coliform sample near the first service connection.
Thank you, Nancy. And now we're at the conclusion of the presentation for the requirements for the surface water, or for the surface water requirements applicable to the revised total coliform rule. The next slides we're going to go through, and it's about 13 slides, and they're basically reference slides. And so I'm not going to go into every single one in detail. Tries to give you the view of the changes that have occurred between the TCR and the RTCR. So the next 13 slides is a side-by-side comparison, and then the issue that's being discussed is on the top so that you can plainly see where that change occurred or where things may have stayed the same. So in this particular slide, the sampling plan, some things have changed in terms of all the sampling sites are going to have to be noted as part of the sampling plan. But in addition, if a surface water system is subject to the groundwater rule requirements because it has a groundwater source that is not part of the treatment as required under subpart H, the groundwater rule sampling locations must also be included in the sample siting plan. As with the TCR, the plans are subject to the state review and revision. So all of these plans and all of the changes are subject to the state review and the revision. The new and updated plans must be completed no later than March 31st, 2016, and the public water systems can use an existing TCR sample siting plan if it meets the requirements of the RTCR. In terms of seasonal systems, under the revised total coliform rule, seasonal systems must now demonstrate and certify completion of a state-approved startup procedure. The routine monitoring requirements is monthly, the same as the current TCR requirements. The state may exempt seasonal systems from the startup requirements if the entire distribution system remains pressurized for the entire year. Remember, Subpart H seasonal systems must monitor monthly and are not eligible for reduced monitoring. In terms of the baseline routine monitoring frequency, that remains the same between the TCR and the RTCR in terms of the population served. For repeat monitoring, we have some changes, and the big change is that everyone, regardless of population served, must do 3 repeat samples. That is your set, 3. In the TCR, if a public water system was serving less than 1,000, they have to do 4. But under the RTCR, everyone, regardless of the population served, it's 3 repeats are needed for every routine total coliform positive. In terms of the locations, under the TCR, public water systems must collect 1 repeat sample from the original total coliform positive site, at least 1 sample at a location within 5 service connections upstream, and at least 1 sample at a location within 5 service connections downstream. Under the RTCR, the same sample procedures as the TCR can be used, or the public water system can specify their sample siting plan that either a fixed alternative location or criteria for selecting sites on a situational basis via a standard operating procedure can be used. In terms of additional routine monitoring, under the RTCR, this requirement was eliminated for all systems that monitor at least monthly. Instead, these systems must take their routine number of samples the following month. So regardless of what happened in month 1, you must continue to take the same number of your routine samples in month 2. When it comes to the acute MCL violation, the big change here is that treatment technique. Total coliform positive alone is no longer an MCL violation. It's associated with E. coli or failing to perform something when an E. coli event occurs. So under the RTCR, there is no MCL for total coliform or fecal coliform, and there's an MCL for E. coli, and the system will incur an MCL violation for E. coli if the system has any of these issues. In terms of the MCL and treatment technique violations in the PN, under the RTCR, the monthly MCL violation is no longer applicable. If the public water system incurs an E. coli MCL violation, they are required to issue a public notice that meets the Tier 1 public notification requirement. For systems that fail to conduct a required Level 1 or Level 2 assessment or fail to complete the required corrective action, they incur a treatment technique violation. This treatment technique violation requires the system to issue a public notice that meets the Tier 2 PN requirements. A seasonal system that fails to complete state-approved startup procedures prior to serving water to the public will also incur a treatment technique violation and must issue public notice that meets the Tier 2 PN requirements. For monitoring and reporting violations and PN, as we said several times, they're now separated. It's 2 different violations for monitoring and reporting, and they have different events that trigger them. Under the RTCR, the monitoring and the reporting violations are tracked separately and can result in multiple violations. All M and R violations require the public water system to issue public notice that meets the Tier 3 public notification requirement. And like I said, this is reference material, so I'm not going through anything in any type of detail because we've gone through all of the detail between yesterday's presentation and today. In terms of the PN and CCR rules and the health effects language, there of course have been some changes to remove the issue of TC and replacing things with just E. coli focus, as Rudd just went through on all the slides that he presented. Same thing here. In terms of analytical methods, under the RTCR, changes were made to the total coliform and E. coli methods. These changes were included in the proposed RTCR, but not necessarily discussed in the agreement in principle, and are consistent with the laboratory certification manual. The changes include change in the holding time definition, requiring dechlorination of the agent, requiring autoclaving of the membrane filtration funnel. The changes to the analytical methods are included in the RTCR under 40 CFR 141.852, as indicated on the bottom of the slide. And if you've already noticed, at the bottom of all the slides, we tried to put the actual citation of the regulation so that you can go back for reference. In terms of variance and exemption, and that's available technology, under the RTCR, public water systems cannot be granted variance or exemption. Under the RTCR, cross-connection control was added to proper maintenance of the distribution system. Also, updated filtration, disinfection, best available technologies were added to include the interim enhanced surface water treatment rule, the LT1, LT2, and the groundwater rule. Now, if you all continue to have questions regarding the RTCR, the first place that you may want to look is at the EPA website and see if the frequently asked questions or all the other documents that we will be posting there answer your questions. If not, your next line of contact will be our regional folks, and I don't know why I don't have, oh, it's at the very end? Okay. It's at the very end, and I'll show that very quickly once we get through the technical corrections, but your next line of contact will be your regional contacts for the state, and we've listed all the regional technical contacts for the revised total coliform rule who are members of the headquarters implementation work group that I discussed earlier that also has representation from 8 of the states. So those are the individuals you should first ask your question. And then, of course, at the end, very end of the presentation, you have my contact information and Nancy's contact information. But before we get to those last two slides, which is the conclusion of our presentation for the surface water requirements, there are some of you might be aware that there are some technical corrections that are planned to the revised total coliform rule, and this information will be published in the Federal Registry. There are about a total of 6. But we wanted to present it to you all, although it has not been published in the Federal Registry, so that you are aware that these changes are coming. And we are going to incorporate into the state technical guidance these changes. So, for example, the primary feed crosswalk will be updated to make better clarifications and a correction of an omission, which I'm going to go into in a minute. So that's why the release is going to take a little longer. We had planned to try and release the technical guide during these training sessions, but we are going to take our time, make all the corrections that we need to, and provide you all the full document in December. Also, please remember that these training sessions are going to be recorded, and everything will be posted on the ASDA website, and we will send the URL link for those recorded training sessions and the documentation that you can download that would allow you to manipulate the files for your particular audiences will be posted at the ASDA website earlier than it is on the EPA website. And the registrants will receive that link, and then you all can distribute it as you feel fit. The other last thing that I wanted to, before we get into the technical corrections, to just sort of give you guys a heads up. As you know, there's some issues with the overall budget, and there is a potential shutdown of the government. Hopefully, it does not affect our groundwater system training that's supposed to occur at the end of October. If it does, you all will be notified if we need to postpone that. So for right now, we have people who have registered, but it could be up in the air until the next week. October 1st, I think, is in a week. So I just wanted to give you all a heads up on that, and to also just bring to your awareness that the groundwater system training that's happening in October, or should happen in October, and the one that is planned for March of 2014, we plan to make it the same. However, if any issues or clarifications come up in the October groundwater systems training, we will make those changes so that we can present it out in the March training. So now the technical corrections. Now, like I said earlier, there are about 6 technical corrections planned for publication in the Federal Registry. It does not, none of these technical corrections change the rule. The substance of the rule requirements remain the same, but there are areas where there were just typos and clarifications are needed. The very first one has to do with the reporting and record-keeping section. There is a reference to 141.858. That reference should be 141.859 to be consistent with the assessment requirement language. In terms of incomplete list of items to be included in the state primacy application, and this is what I referred to earlier, will be updated in the state implementation guidance and the primacy crosswalks that are included as part of that. There was an omission in what the state needs to have a written description for. It only went up to 8. It needs to go up to 9, which is the complete section of the requirements under 142.16. There was some language that may be vague and confusing. In this particular section, the word optional criteria was used. In reality, it's not. When you refer back to the criteria that the states must specify that they would use to make this determination, we don't use the word optional. There's a set of, I believe it's like 3 that the state can choose from, and I guess that's why this language was put here, but we are going to clarify that and note that optional criteria refers to the criteria found in these 2 sections of the title where the state selects at least 1. So there may be a removal of the word optional, or a different word may be placed there. The third one, vague and confusing language. This one has to do with the special primacy application again. So it's the whole wording of optional, and please, all of the language that you see in yellow is suggested language, and it may change by the time it gets to the publication. But this gives you all a heads up of what was considered confusing or vague and how the recommendation is being moved forward to correct it. When it comes to the, this is what? Oh, Appendix A. This is the violations and other situations requiring public notice. Although this is within the requirements, this particular table omitted some of this information because it's sending things that you must still do as part of the PN, but there has been some discussion of including it here as well so that this table reflects the whole. The analytical method table. There was a mistake by the Office of Federal Registry, and the methods and the citation was switched. So it will be removed from the column that says method and put under citation. And the last one is something having to do with imperfect numbering. Once again, does not affect the requirements, just that this was supposed to be identified as being reserved, number 2. So with that, this is our last 2 slides before we really turn the switch off on this particular training, and then we're going to look at some of the questions just to see if we want to answer some of the questions that might have come in while Rudd and myself were doing the presentation. And this is the list of your 10 regional technical contacts. So if you have further questions, concerns, issues, please contact these individuals for a more immediate response. However, in terms of headquarters, I am the rule manager for the revised total coliform rule, and I'm dealing with the rollout of the implementation product. I work very closely with the rule writers, which are Tom Grubbs, Julie Javier, and Sean Conley. So when questions or issues come into either myself or Nancy, we definitely sit down with the rule writers and come up with one response. And sometimes people know Tom directly and Sean and Julie, and they just send things directly to them, and they always backtrack and include us as well.
And the same when we receive responses from states, we always include your EPA regional representative in our response back also.
So everyone is kept in the loop. And in terms of our presentation, this concludes the presentation on the surface water requirements, but now I'm going to shift it over to answering any questions that may have come up, and then I saved you all a full day and part of today, so we should all be out of here by 4 o'clock. Thank you, everyone. Now, turning it over to Sean and Julie and Tom.
Okay, so we'll start, let's see, regarding like if you do not take repeats, sorry if there was a confusion earlier. So if you do not take your repeats or miss any of your repeats, that is a level 1 assessment. It triggers a level 1 assessment and is not defined as a monitoring violation. Sorry if there's confusion about that. And then there's an additional question of why failure to collect repeat samples is not a monitoring violation. So, Tom, would you like to?
Yeah, many of the requirements in the rule were based on recommendations from the Federal Advisory Committee that was convened to make recommendations to EPA on how to modify and update the existing total coliform rule. And one of their thoughts was that evidence that a system was well run would be that they took their required repeat samples. And failure to take those samples was, rather than just making that a monitoring violation that would be addressed as part of the consumer confidence report up to a year later or even longer, and no formal PN required, they thought it appropriate that the system do an assessment and find out why their internal requirements their internal SOP broke down and they didn't collect those required samples. So that's the reason why that happened. The advisory committee also recommended that failure to take routine samples remain as a monitoring violation, because generally the systems that fail to take the routine samples monitor infrequently, and especially in the case of transient non-community systems, have frequent turnover of owners and or operators.
There's a question here on seasonal systems, and it says, it sounds like PWS must submit to the state a certification that they have completed the state-approved startup procedure each year before they begin service. And yes, that is correct. There's another question here about additional routine samples, and this question came in after or before the slide went up about what an additional routine sample is. But this was a requirement in the TCR for systems that did not sample every month. If they had a positive result, they would have to sample some in the next month. This requirement was dropped for systems that take at least one sample a month. So for surface water systems, it no longer applies because they have to monitor monthly anyway. Where this applies, and we'll get into that more in the groundwater presentation, is that when some small groundwater systems are able to do reduced monitoring either quarterly or annually, if they have positive results, they may have to take additional routine samples the next month. But again, it's more of a requirement for groundwater systems smaller than 1,000 on quarterly or annual monitoring. It doesn't apply really in today's presentation, but we thought we'd include it just for clarification.
There's a question on what's the time frame to keep microbiological results. There seems to be confusion. It says the original TCR, well, according to the comment, the original TCR required microbiological results to be kept for 3 years. It's actually 5 years. So that did not change in the RTCR. So the RTCR also requires that these results be kept for 5 years. So is there like a typo in this slide perhaps? So they're looking, yeah. So we're looking at the slides right now to see if we made a typo.
Are they referring to the difference between what the state needs to keep and what the public water system needs to keep? Because the state needs to keep the analyses they receive for 1 year. The state record keeping.
Didn't say.
They don't specify.
It didn't specify. Okay. There's a question whether an E. coli MCL violation also triggers a level 2 assessment. Yes, that is correct. So if you get an MCL violation, that's a trigger for a level 2 assessment. Okay, so we want to reiterate that your compliance is based on the number of routine and repeat samples that you've taken for the month, and not just on the number of routine samples that you've taken. And this is actually stated in 141.858 A5.
And it's also, that's not a change from TCR either. That was required in TCR, and it was maintained in RTCR.
Yeah. So all routine and repeats are included in your compliance determination, not just your routine. Okay. Clarify when you miss an E. coli sample. So if you did not sample for E. coli after a routine sample, that is a monitoring violation. If you did not monitor for E. coli in the repeat sample, that is a MCL violation.
Now, the rationale behind that differentiation is, and again, this was based on Federal Advisory Committee recommendation, was how close you were to a violation. When you fail to analyze the routine sample for E. coli, you are at least 2 steps away from an E. coli MCL violation. It would take both a total coliform positive repeat sample and then the E. coli positive, so it would require 2. In the case of failing to analyze for E. coli in a repeat sample, that means you've already had a repeat or a routine total coliform positive sample and a repeat total coliform positive sample. So you are only one step away from having an MCL violation. And that's the rationale. If you were within one step of having a violation, and by failing to take that step, you can guarantee that you won't have a violation, it's considered a violation. It's considered to be willfully avoiding the demonstration that you've complied. For the others, it was not seen that way and not recommended to be handled. But based on experience with the total coliform rule, there was evidence that systems were electing a monitoring violation in lieu of a possible MCL violation. And the advisory committee wanted to address that concern.
Okay. There's a question on which of the monitoring or reporting violations don't trigger Tier 3PN. All monitoring and reporting violations trigger at Tier 3PN. So what we have in 141.860 C and D, I think, they all trigger at Tier 3PN. Okay, so another clarification. So if you get triggered into an assessment, there is no violation incurred by just triggering an assessment. The violation, the treatment technique violation, is incurred when you do not do the assessment, or you found a sanitary defect and did not correct that sanitary defect. So that's when the violation comes in. It's like if you, as I said, you do not do your assessment or you do not do your corrective action. Being triggered into an assessment is not a violation. So you don't need to do a Tier 2 notification. All right. Someone asked about the definition of a special purpose sample. So Tom, would you like to?
Yes. And specifically, that a sample, a special purpose sample isn't classified as routine or repeat. That's not actually in the regulatory language. Special purpose samples, the wording in the RTCR is exactly the same as the wording in the TCR. And how they are handled should be exactly the same. Special purpose samples are samples that are done to address a specific issue and to protect public health. And the concern was that if special purpose samples were included in compliance calculations, systems and or states might be tempted to not do necessary monitoring to identify and correct an issue because they would be afraid of triggering a violation rather than looking at what the cause of the problem was and correcting it to protect public health. So again, the provisions for special purpose samples are contained in the RTCR at 141.853B. Those same provisions are in the total coliform rule at 141.21A6.
Okay, so there's a question on whether the CCR that's going to be due in 2017 will cover 2016 for both the TCR and the RTCR reporting details. And the answer is yes. Because the RTCR does not come into effect until April 1, 2016. So for the first 3 months of 2016, you're still under the TCR. Okay. CCR, it's like the actual corrective action, or are they not included in the CCR, only the number of corrective actions? Yes. That's what we have in the regulation. So there's a question about what's the difference between a level 1 and a level 2 assessment. So level 1 and level 2, they are looking at the same elements, but at a different level of detail and different depth. A level 2 assessment is triggered by more significant events, like you have an E. coli, MCL violation, and what was the other? Yes. So that's why there's more effort involved in a level 2 assessment. And also, who could conduct a level 1 and a level 2 assessment are sort of different. There's a difference there. A level 1 assessment, the system conducts, so we put the system can conduct a level 1 assessment. The level 2 assessment, the assessor must be a party approved by the state. So it could be the system itself, a third party, or the state itself.
As a little bit more information for that, again, the intention of the advisory committee was for level 1 assessment for it to be a self-assessment so that the system would learn a little bit more about itself and would learn how to identify problems maybe before they showed up as a total coliform positive sample. However, for those more serious problems, whether it's repeated level 1 triggers or a level 2 trigger, the thought was that you needed to get somebody with a greater depth of knowledge to conduct that. And because they have that greater depth of knowledge, they'll know more about where to look. Also, the scope of their where they're looking may be greater. Again, EPA anticipates that most of the level 1 and level 2 assessments will be conducted at small systems, especially small transient systems, both because they are the greatest percentage of public water systems and because they're the ones that have the least access to the technical and financial resources to address these issues. So where the ability of the small system to identify the issues and figure out what corrective actions are necessary, which is reflected as a level 2 assessment being required, somebody else will have to come in and conduct that assessment.
Okay, I think in terms of the many questions that we received, that concludes responses from Tom and Julie and Sean. However, what we are going to do is we have the questions as they were posted in a document. And for some of these questions that we see that there's a consistent trend in terms of asking it, we more than likely will put that up as part of our frequently asked questions, or it will be noted in one of our documents. But I'm not promising every single one will be responded to in writing, but we will look at them and see what we can do. Thank you, everyone, for participating, and hopefully we are engaged with each other again in October for the groundwater rule. Based on today's or based on this training session, the groundwater rule is probably double the size of the surface. I mean, the groundwater requirements, I'm sorry, the groundwater requirements for the revised total coliform rule is probably double in size to what we went over the last 2 days. And so I really think we may end up going into day 3, but once again, day 3 is always a just in case we need to have it. And you do have a lot of the requirements that you have learned as part of the surface water, the surface water system requirements are going to be repeated, but I'm just giving you guys a heads up that we more than likely will need that 3rd day. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
The